Well, let's go ahead and start. Thank you again for joining us. This is the UT Energy Symposium on September 14th, 2021. I'm Dave Tuttle from the University of Texas at Austin Energy Institute. Thanks for joining us. Our guest today is Brett Perlman, CEO of the Center for Houston's Future. And his topic is changing world oil markets and the Texas economy. And we thank him for coming. He's an expert in so many ways. Let me give a short bio. Brett Perlman serves as the CEO of the Center for Houston's Future, a nonprofit organization working to address matters of highest importance to the long-term future of the greater Houston region. His career has spanned senior positions in business, government, and community service organizations. Perlman served for 4 years as a commissioner on the Public Utility Commission of Texas, where he was appointed in 1999 by then Governor George W. Bush, and helped herd the Texas market into restructuring. He holds an advanced degree in public policy from Harvard University and in law from the University of Texas, and was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate at Northwestern University. So with that, Brett, let me turn it over to you. Oh, and by the way, let me also share with you.
Well,
we do have the whole semester filled up with a great set of topics. The whole semester, we like you to look at the Energy Symposium website to go look at the ones of interest and join us every Tuesday at 12:30 for these future discussions. So with that, let me stop sharing. Brett, it's all yours.
Okay, Dave. Well, thanks for having me. And this is a real pleasure to do. And I just wanted to compliment you and Carrie and others on the work that you did on ERCOT. So, you know, we worked on electric restructuring. I'm not going to really talk about that unless someone asks a question about it today. But, you know, I think the work that UT is doing and looking at what happened in February and how we get the market back to where the vision we had for it, I think is really important work. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as we get started here. I'm here to talk today a little bit about a piece of work we did with Texas 2036. And for those of you who aren't aware of Texas 2036, it's an organization started by Tom Luce, who has had an illustrious career in law and public policy, and is now being run by Margaret Spelling, former senior advisor to Governor and then President Bush, and former Secretary of Education. And they are looking at the future of the state of Texas. You might wonder about the significance of 2036. That's actually the 200th anniversary of the state of Texas. And so a lot of the work that they're doing and we're doing is looking 15 years out in the future to understand the impact of future energy markets on the fiscal and macroeconomic health of the state of Texas. So we partnered with them on this piece of work that you're going to see today. And I have a slight problem in sharing. Let me go. I have this problem from time to time. I can't get the PowerPoint to advance. So let's see if that worked. You know, it worked a minute ago. Of course, it works in the test and then didn't work in the. So let me see. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, here we go. So just a brief note on the Center for Houston's Future. I joined as the CEO 4 years ago, really because I saw it as a great platform to look out into the future and to work on bringing together business, government, and community stakeholders on some of the biggest issues that are affecting the Houston region. And so we're looking out in the future at global trends and their local impacts. And what you're going to see today is some of that work. I'm going to show you a little bit of that work we're doing on energy. We're doing some work with Alan Lloyd and Mike Lewis on hydrogen. And then I'll talk about our work on the fiscal impacts of oil prices on the state economy. And so a little bit of a bait and switch, but let me just kind of quickly give you the overview of what we're doing on the energy transition. So we've been working with the Greater Houston Partnership on a vision for the Houston energy transition. We're calling it HEDI, Houston Energy Transition Initiative. And the idea here is to leverage Houston's energy leadership to accelerate global solutions for a low carbon future. And we think that Houston can lead in the energy transition and address climate change because of the really amazing asset base that we have in engineering and infrastructure and renewable energy, the startup ecosystem we're developing, of course, the Port of Houston. And so this is really, I think, a set of assets that are unparalleled, both nationally and perhaps globally. And so we are working to create a plan to make Houston not only the energy capital of the world, but the low carbon energy capital of the world. And so we are doing work in to that end in carbon capture, utilization, and storage, in hydrogen, in circular economy, in battery manufacturing, and in what we're calling new energy industries like renewables, LNG, low carbon LNG, renewable natural gas, and biofuels. And then we're developing cross-cutting initiatives, basically workforce and policy initiatives that will affect all the energy value chains. And so this piece of work is just getting launched in Houston, and you may be hearing a little bit about it going forward. We had a conference in June where we kicked this off. In fact, we have been working on this at the center for 2 years, and I'm going to show you that work in a second, but the Greater Houston Partnership is going to be championing this as well, and I think it's going to be really an impactful set of activities. This is the work that we've done. We worked with the University of Houston on this project about 2 years ago called 4 Ways Forward, Houston, the Low Carbon Energy Capital, which identified those 4 areas in which I showed you a few minutes ago. And then we followed up with a couple other research reports, which are available on our website, one on carbon capture that University of Houston did, and then one on hydrogen that we did. And as I mentioned, we've been working with both Alan and Mike on the AH2 at Scale project that they have on hydrogen. This work has started to get some traction, and here you can see a story in the business section of the Houston Chronicle talking about Houston becoming positioned as a leader in the hydrogen economy, and then an editorial talking about hydrogen's potential for the region to give new life to existing infrastructure. So exactly the type of things that we're talking about. So I just wanted to give you just a quick overview of that work without spending that much time on it. There's a ton on our website if you're interested, and perhaps maybe even there might be an opportunity to engage in that discussion with the symposium at some future date. So what I'd like to turn my attention to is what I came to talk about, which is the report that we wrote with Texas 2036 on changing world oil markets and the Texas economy. And I think you're going to find this interesting. It was a scenario-based analysis of future oil prices, and it looked at our state's GDP, employment, and public education funding. And as you can see, we got a lot of good press on this. This is an opinion piece in the Dallas Morning News that I wrote with Margaret Spellings on some of the research. And so we were able to place articles around the state, and actually some of this work became implemented through some legislation. I won't talk that much about it, but there were a number of bills to address the state, the permanent school fund, which we'll talk about at the very end in the last legislative session, some of the some of the improvements that we started to identify as part of this work. So I think it's already having an impact, but we want to spend a little time today talking to you about what the findings were. So this problem that we identified is a problem that others have looked at. This is a report from the Dallas Fed, and it's looking at this idea of resource-intensive economies and the estimated impact of changing oil prices on those economies. And as you can see, Texas in particular is as an oil-producing state, is one of the states where changes in oil prices can have a big impact on the economy. And so this has been work done by the Dallas Fed. I will note also that there was a really good paper done out of Texas Tech that was just presented. I think it won an award at the International Association of Energy Economists on the same topic, looking at some ways the same issues that we're looking at today. And so this set of issues has been around for a while. Sometimes they go by the name of the plenty paradox, the idea that a place that is a place where there are extensive resources, can run into problems from time to time as volatility affects the industry. And so that's the class of problems we're talking about. And so what did we do? We looked at a number of scenarios, and what we picked as scenarios, as you'll see in a minute, is we picked some what we're calling low but plausible oil price scenarios to understand how low oil prices would affect the state's fiscal health and macroeconomic activity. And so a couple things in here, you might wonder why we picked the low price scenario as well. We're not worried about high oil prices, obviously. If we have a future where oil prices are high for a long period of time, then I think the impacts will be positive for the state. And as we were talking about with before the broadcast a little bit, we picked oil markets, and you'll see in a second why, but it should be fairly obvious to those on the call that the Permian has really transformed the oil industry. It's become a global marginal producer, which certainly wasn't historically true. And so focusing on oil has given us a way to think about pricing and how oil prices start to affect the state of Texas. So just a quick summary of what we found, and we'll get into the details of this as we go through the report. So there's a lot of numbers on this page. Don't worry about it. We'll delve into these in some detail. But we looked at three impacts of oil prices. We looked at the effect on employment and GSP. We looked at the effect on state and local tax collections. And then we looked at the impact on K through 12 education. And the K through 12 one you might scratch your head about, but as you'll see in a few minutes, our system of financing at the state level, K through 12 education is highly dependent on oil prices. And so that's kind of a risk that probably people hadn't thought about, but we were able to look at that in some detail and document it. The first one on the economy, I think people pretty much understand in terms of how energy prices might affect the state's employment and gross state product. But we were able to use some of these scenarios, and I'm going to talk in more detail about the scenario. But what we're talking about on this page is a $30 barrel scenario by 2036, which is kind of our most extreme scenario, and you'll see the others in a few minutes. But if that scenario were to come to pass, you can see that the impact on the state economy would be rather serious. It would result in a $155 billion drop in terms of GSP from a baseline of $281 billion over the course of and 1.6 trillion over the course of 15 years, using 2019 as a baseline. That would be in 2036 a 55% decline. So pretty serious decline. And of course, that's the game we're playing. We're looking at how do we stress the economy in low oil price scenarios. So not saying this is going to happen, just saying this is a corner case that we can look at and test how sensitive the Texas economy is to volatility in oil prices. We did the same thing for state and local tax collections, and of course found a very similar result. We found that there could be a drop from about $13.4 billion to of $9.7 billion, which would be a 73% drop in terms of tax collections. Now, lest anyone get too concerned, that's about 10% of the state's budget. So it's a significant percent, but it's not something that can't be made up. And as we'll see, as Texas has become more diversified over time, these impacts have become are significant, but somewhat muted than they were perhaps 15 or 20 years ago. And then finally, the same result on K through 12 education. Basically, K through 12 education receives about $5.8 billion, close to $6 billion in terms of funding from the E&P sector. And if we were to play the game on our scenario analysis, we'd see that drop by about $1.8 billion, a 31% decline. So those are the high-level findings that we're going to look at today and discuss in some detail. But you can see that looking at the scenario-based approach and the corner case of a drop to $30 a barrel would have rather significant effects on the Texas economy. I think that would be the main conclusion I'd want you to take away from this piece of research. So how did we do this? Well, we had an evolving, I will say, process to do it, which you see here. First, we developed some oil price scenarios. We did this by convening a number of experts in the field to help us with this. Michael Weber, in fact, was one of our experts. Amy Jaffe, who many of you know, who used to be at the Baker Institute, was another one. And we had several others who we were grateful for their help in putting this together. And we agreed on 4 low but plausible scenarios for oil prices through the year 2036. Then we, taking those prices, we were able to forecast oil and gas production, and we're very fortunate to have the Bureau of Economic Geology help us do this with a model they have called the Toro model. And by using that model that is called the Type Oil Resource Assessment Model, we were able to actually project statewide oil and gas production volumes under these various scenarios. So we had prices and quantities, and with the prices and quantities, we could then develop a spreadsheet model to calculate revenue based both and to estimate impacts on GSP and employment, and we had a methodology for doing that. And then because of the interest in K through 12 education, we looked in detail, and we won't talk about that too much today, but we looked in detail at the impacts that oil prices might have in K through 12 education. That surprising result of how our education system is tied to our energy economy. And so that was the process that we used to do this. So I'm going to walk you through each of the steps in the process, starting with our price scenario development. And I think the first thing to understand, and I know that this audience is aware of this, that in Texas energy today, it's all about the Permian. Really, the Permian dominates Texas E&P activity. It's responsible, just the Permian, for about 68% of 2019 oil production and about 41% of Texas gas production. And when you add that to the Eagle Ford, so the Permian and the Eagle Ford tied together, that's about 87% of the production. So simply by being able to leverage that insight and being able to model the Permian and Eagle Ford, which is what the Toro model, which I'll explain in a second, allowed us to do, we were able to start developing some of these insights. And on the left-hand side, you can kind of see what's happened in the Permian. I think we all understand this story. The Permian has been, this amazing growth story in terms of the number of barrels of oil it's produced. You can see the hockey stick there through 2019. And then, of course, we know what happened more recently in terms of the impacts of the oil price shock. So we didn't really focus, we're really focused on the long term, not the short term. But we certainly are aware, and I guess this is what we were trying to study as well, the impact of a significant drop in oil demand going from 100 million barrels per day to 85 million barrels at the in March of the of last year during the beginning of the pandemic. We can see the impact of basically production going one way as OPEC and Russia fought it out, and demand going the other way. So what we've come to understand is that Texas is a marginal producer of oil. And so we sort of took the hit in balancing the market here. And we saw these significant declines both in oil production and in gas production as a result of the pandemic. So that's kind of an example of what we, while we weren't focused on that, an example of what we were trying to model in this study. So what did we do? We looked at 4 scenarios. We looked at a constant $60 scenario, and this scenario implies that OPEC continues to maintain price discipline. OPEC has a cost of sort of a regulatory cost of production of in the $60 to $70 a barrel range. So to continue to maintain their economy, they have to keep prices at that level. And if they were able to do that, if OPEC was able to maintain discipline over global oil price producers, then obviously prices would probably be at the high end. And we're starting to seeing that play out today as oil prices, as demand starts to come back into play, and we're starting to see the impact of that on oil prices in a post-pandemic world. On the other side, we said we wanted to model a declining scenario, so we picked $40 to $30 barrel, and we picked that scenario because we saw that at the low end of the range for OPEC in terms of its ability to continue to produce, or the Permian to continue to produce oil. OPEC, obviously, Saudi Arabia, for example, has very low production prices, but this is what it would take for marginal producers in the Permian to make money. And that sort of factors in some productivity improvements as well. So people could continue to make money as productivity inclines. It might be the break even today in the Permian might be around 40, but we see it declining to 30. That's why we had the declining price there from our low scenario. So that bounded our range. And then we looked at 2 intermediate scenarios, one what we call the one boom, one bust cycle. And I think we understand well the boom and bust cycle. And then we looked at a 2 boom, 2 bust cycle over 15 years. So just some other scenarios to see how they played out. I think when we did the analysis, the 2 dominant scenarios were the high price scenario and the low price scenario. Those are the ones that we ended up focusing on most for most of the research we did. And these 2 boom bust cycles, they sort of just washed out in the analysis. One thing to note on this chart, and I think it's kind of interesting, if you look at what the comptroller's office does in terms of its oil price forecast, it has some really very aggressive and I would say optimistic numbers about where prices are going. And so they're not using those in particular for the for forecasting the budget, but we did find that they had some numbers that we sort of scratched our heads about, quite frankly, and never really got to the bottom of it in this research and sort of understanding that. Maybe there's someone from the comptroller's office that could could elucidate us on that perhaps as we get into this. And I noticed that my colleague Richard Stubbe just joined, who did all this work. So I'm going to let Richard talk, kind of do the play-by-play, and he can do the color commentary as we sort of move through this. So welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Brett.
So that was the first part of the analysis. So if we had prices, then we wanted to look at quantities. And as I mentioned, as it turned out, we sort of stumbled across this, frankly, the Torah model that the Bureau of Economic Geology has, and we're very grateful to Amory Goodman and Silvanta Konikova, who basically helped us with this and took our low price scenarios and ran them through the model. I think this hadn't been done before by BEG, and so they were actually interested in understanding the results of these kind of scenarios on production in the Permian. And so what we found was these curves, and you can see the black curve is our constant $60 a barrel scenario, and then the orange curve, perhaps appropriate for UT, is the $30, 40 going to 30, and you can see the impact on production. Production, I guess, gets as low as, what did we say, under 2 billion barrels a day under the $30 scenario going out to 2036. So if you look at the difference between the black line and the orange line, that kind of gives you your range of cases in terms of how much production we could potentially see coming out of the Permian under a $60 scenario, and then a 40 going to $30 scenario. So those are the two extreme cases. So given that we had price and quantity, we were then able to start working on using that information to look at oil prices and their impact on the Texas economy. And so, as we all know, in the 80s, there was a tight coupling between oil and the Texas economy, and we saw this sort of cycle play out many times over the years in terms of the collapse of the oil market and then the return over time as the Texas economy has become more diversified. Okay, so let me just pick up where I left off. I was talking about the impact of oil prices on the Texas economy and talking about the boom and bust cycle that we've had historically. And obviously, as we've become more diversified, it's having a less impact, but still a major force in the Texas economy. So E&P activity accounts for about 250,000 direct jobs and about 10% of the state's gross domestic product. And we can still see the impact of the volatility, as I mentioned before, and we saw that certainly with the pandemic, which combined with the collapse of oil prices caused a drop in E&P employment by about 20%. So we saw, as you'll see in a second, similar impacts from our low but plausible oil price scenarios in terms of the impact on the state's economy. And it could be, rather significant impacts in terms of potential drops from between 25 and 55%. So, just to start this discussion, as I mentioned, oil accounts for E&P activity in general, both oil and gas accounts for about a little over 10% of the direct activity. I saw, the Railroad Commission pegged it at 30%, which included some of the indirect jobs and imputed jobs that might be created as well. We did not model that, but obviously there's some additional impact from multiplier effects in the Texas economy that would take you up somewhat above the 10%. Maybe I don't know if we'll get as high as we would if we would have gotten as high as 30%, but certainly there is some impact. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the jobs that have created and the volatility in the employment. We can see the big hump there around the shale revolution, the big drop in 16, the fact that we were climbing back through 19. Of course, we don't have the the 20 data on this chart, but you would have seen another drop as a result of the pandemic. And so you can start to see the impact of the boom and bust cycle in terms of employment. And so what we did is we just applied our scenarios to this, and we looked at, and what you're seeing here is the impact on jobs. And again, we have the spaghetti chart, which has both our 4 scenarios. If you look on the bottom there, the constant $60 scenario, and then the burnt orange and the $40 to $30 one. And then in the middle, you can see the 1 and 2 cycle ones. And then those other lines, the green line and the red line there are basically the comptroller's forecast of jobs going out. And so if you looked at the red versus black, you would see that our forecast is slightly under the comptroller's forecast. But I think the interesting thing to note is the shape of them. They both sort of flatten out, even in the high scenario. And then certainly in the our low scenario, our burnt orange one is definitely lower than what the comptroller was forecasting. And so we saw jobs going from 250,000 to down to 150,000. So a significant loss of jobs, as technology starts to improve and combined with, the scenario we ran with oil price declines. Same thing now that you understand how to decode the charts in terms of state gross state product. And you can see that under the high scenario, the black line, the constant dollar one, we continue to grow our share of GSP, going up to about $300 billion. But you can see the negative impact with the orange line, the declining by over 150 billion as a result of the scenario we ran, the low scenario we ran. So that's kind of bracketing the impact on both employment and state domestic product, and sort of the range of potential results that we could posit from the scenarios that we ran. So again, a big impact, but still about 10% of the overall state economy. And so I think as we continue I think that one of the lessons from this is diversification is key. And some of the energy transition work that we're doing is really about, at the end of the day, is about diversification. Can we take the assets that we're creating and diversify into other markets? And so that was, I think, the reason we want to do that work. In addition to addressing climate change, it has the impact of diversifying our economy, and also has the impact as well of creating new industries, which could be turned into major export industries. And so I think there's a lot of benefit from continuing not only to diversify our economy as a whole, but also continuing to diversify Texas oil and gas production into low carbon energy production, which is the work we're doing at the center. The next thing we looked at is the impact on the state's budget. And so in Texas, E&P activity contributes about $13.5 billion to the public coffers. And the main pieces of this are severance taxes, sales taxes, property taxes, and then royalties. And we'll see that breakdown in a second. The Economic Stabilization Fund, the Rainy Day Fund, which is funded by severance taxes from oil and natural gas production, was basically put in to balance the economy many years ago, to address this in the 90s, 80s and 90s, was put in to address the fact that we knew that oil was volatile, and we needed to create basically a shock absorber for that. So that shock absorber may be affected under our more pessimistic scenarios, and could have some budgetary impacts on the state's budget. So as the state's budget declines, there's no longer that shock absorber to absorb the impact. And then we looked at impacts on the $6 billion that the E&P sector contributes to public education, which is about 20% of the $30 billion that we spend annually on education in the state. And so what we found was about 25% of this was collected through property taxes by local ISDs, and the remaining 75% was collected by the state in terms of the royalties and taxes, primarily, as you'll see in a second, through severance taxes and state taxes. And so as I mentioned, the headline for this report is that weak oil markets could have an impact on those amounts. And then you'll see at the end, and we're not going to talk about it much here, but one of the components of the way that we fund public education is through the Permanent School Fund. We didn't look at the Permanent University Fund that funds higher education, but we did look at the Permanent School Fund because it's funded primarily by E&P activities. And we actually saw less of an impact here, interestingly enough, because, and some opportunities, frankly, because the corpus of the Permanent School Fund is so large. And so this is really, I think, an asset that we can use to help the energy transition. And so even if this asset declines, if we can continue to get good returns out of the Permanent School Fund, then that could help us in the transition. So that's one of the things that we discovered along the lines, as part of the journey that we did. Now, I will say that there are some changes and I think some of those were, as I mentioned, were starting to be addressed by the legislature in terms of how the Permanent School Fund is managed. So that's one of the things that needs to be addressed, that we found that needs to be addressed. So this is just a breakdown of the revenues. And if you just focus for a second on the last column, the 2019 column, you can see the little over 13.5 billion that we collect from the E&P sector in terms of royalties and state and local taxes. And then you can see the impact of oil production, severance taxes, both in oil and natural gas. And oil production obviously is the biggest piece of that by far. It's the biggest number on the page, but state and local taxes are also significant. And so those are the big contributors to our state budget, as well as property taxes, which are assessed in oil and gas properties. And so that's how you get to the $11 billion. And if you add the $2 billion in terms of royalties that are collected, you get to the $13 billion number. So that's the inflows. In terms of the outflows, where does the money go? Well, it goes into a number of buckets, and we'll talk about those buckets in some detail and how those buckets play out. But first, let's look just for a second at what the modeling results show for the state budget as a whole, and then we'll sort of disaggregate this into pieces. So if you look again at the black line and the difference between the black line and the orange line, you can see the impact of declining oil prices under the scenarios we ran on the state's budget. And as you can see, it could be significant, going from 13 billion today to less than 5 billion, 3.7 billion in 2036. So a very significant drop between what it is today and the baseline that it is today and where it might end up in 2036 under the low price scenario. And then you can compare that to the black line, which is the $60 scenario. And you can see that, it's a slightly rosier picture, increasing to about 15 billion. Interestingly enough, if you look at the green and the red lines, those are the comptrollers for similar forecasts, and they had much more aggressive numbers, particularly in their fall 19 report that they wrote. Those came down somewhat in 2020, but certainly higher than under our scenarios. And so those are questions that we continue to look at and try to understand the differences between. So that's kind of the macro impact of the state budget. Then in terms of the impact on public school financing, this Rube Goldberg-esque diagram here, which I won't I won't make you go through it in any detail, but you can see how complex state education funding is. And as I mentioned, when you think about this link between the oil prices and K through 12 education, this is why, because the four ways in which we collect taxes, our revenues from the oil industry, have impacts at various points in the and flow through to ultimately through to fund our education process, our state education program. And so you can see that on the right-hand side, oil and gas revenues, royalties flow into both the Permanent University Fund and the Permanent School Fund, and then ultimately flow through to the Foundation School Fund, and the Foundation School Program, which is how we fund education. So I'm not going to get into the minutia of how we actually fund education in the state. That would be a completely different discussion, but you can kind of see how these things start to flow through. Same thing for oil and gas severance taxes, how they flow through both to general revenues and then ultimately flow through the rainy day fund, which is kind of in the middle, the small bubble in the middle of the chart there, how they flow through to the rainy day fund. And then ultimately some of that revenue flows into the Foundation School Fund. And similarly with state taxes, they go into GR and then into the Foundation School Fund and ultimately into schools. And then on the left-hand side, you can see how local property taxes fit into this equation in terms of collection by ISDs and counties, which are then remitted to school districts. So this is kind of the model, very complex, difficult model to understand. And frankly, it took us a while to kind of get our arms around it and then to be able to model it. But when we did, what we were able to show again is that same sort of pattern of comparing a baseline where about $6 billion of funding goes to, today from E&P revenues into the education system. And then you can see this time the gray line, which is our decline scenario, and then the constant $60 one, which is confusingly this time is the orange one. And you can see the difference between the dotted line and then the orange and the gray lines, and where we might end up. So state education would be impacted as well by these changing in oil prices, and you can see how we modeled those potential assumptions there. And then finally, just to close this out, and then we can turn it to questions. We did sort of dive down and take a look at the Permanent School Fund, and as I mentioned before, we could see very significant decreases in the size of the contributions to this, but the corpus of the fund is so large that it is a huge asset for the state. And so the $46 billion that's in the fund today really provides, I think, that cushion that I mentioned before that could be used to help us with the transition. But currently the fund is split between the General Land Office and the State Board of Education, and they both have different philosophies on how to manage the fund. And so there is some work to be done, I think, in managing this as a whole, as we do with teachers' retirement and other types of funds in the state, and getting a consistent type of return out of these buckets, which I think is one of the issues that we identified. And so just to finish up, we also looked at severance taxes, and we did see a bigger impact here. And so if you look at our steady decline case, that's our basically our 40 going to 30 scenario, the second set of columns, you can see the impact in terms of declines. If we looked at our baseline estimate of $6 billion in severance tax, $5.5 billion in severance tax collections versus a steady decline scenario where it could go down as by as much as 3.8 billion. So I know I've thrown a lot of numbers at you, but I think the high level conclusion from this work is that Texas has diversified its economy, but oil and gas is still an important sector, both in terms of employment, in terms of gross state product, in terms of our state budget, and in terms of our education system. And these, as we start to think about the future of the oil and gas industry and how the oil and gas industry is going to evolve, we also need to be thinking a little bit about diversification of our revenue base and how we protect both the education system, K through 12 education system, as well as our state budget and our economy, against these potential threats. And so with that, I will stop sharing, and Dave, turn it back over to you. And maybe Richard, maybe I'll just ask you if you joined again for any comments or anything you wanted to make, since you did most of the work on this.
Thanks, Brett, and hello, everyone. I think Brett did an excellent job in summarizing it. I think the key point, the couple key points to emphasize at the end are, one, in which Brett already did, one, that the system is extremely arcane, confusing, and balkanized. And as a result, it's very difficult to make simple extrapolations on impact of oil prices on various elements of the fiscal situation in Texas. And then second is that while the Texas economy has diversified significantly in the last 30 years, it's still very heavily reliant on the oil and gas E&P sector. And if oil prices remain low or fall during the energy transition over the next several decades, it is going to still hurt the Texas fiscal situation fairly considerably. So it behooves the state and thought leaders around the state to really anticipate and prepare for a possible future with soft oil prices. And as a result of that, not only diversify the economy, but also probably diversify and streamline the funding mechanisms to be somewhat clearer and less reliant on the oil and gas sector.
Great. So Dave, we'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. So some questions to finish up. Excellent, and thank you so much. So in the report, it talked about shale being a quick response marginal supply source, I guess sort of like peakers or intermediates on the wholesale electricity market. And that can create a pricing umbrella or a pricing cap. And one of the questions is, will Texas shale be the lowest cost marginal quick response supply globally? It's obvious that OPEC and some of those countries, Saudi Arabia, has the lowest cost resource, period. But will Texas have that opportunity to have some stability in that business model, being that the lowest cost quick response? Now I have some other questions too.
Okay, I'm going to let Richard take that one first, because he spent a ton of time looking at this issue.
Based on our review of the information and discussions with numerous experts in the sector, the short answer, David, is yes. That the Permian shale, amongst all the shale resources that can be quickly ramped up or throttled back in response to changing market conditions, if shale is the only resource that can do that, of all the shale resources in the world, the Permian is the best positioned for that in general. I'm sure there are isolated exceptions to it, but as a general rule of thumb, that is I think a generally accepted perspective to have. Okay,
and follow up on that is, it was invented here, George Mitchell inventing and perfecting it in Texas. So is shale really going to be more, and fracking, more a specialty in the US, or is it going to be going to other markets as well, and then flood the market with new supplies from others accepting that technology? Or is there something special about what we do or what we have in the US that will make it more strongly deployed in the US?
Richard, go ahead. I'll let you take that one too. You were getting all the hard questions.
Again, this is more crystal balling than retrospective fact base here. But Texas has, from its intrinsic geologic resource, an advantage, but it also has a local skill and knowledge advantage that is going to be difficult to export. There are shale resources around the world that are promising. Maybe some are as promising as the Permian. We've heard very good things about some Chinese shale resource, some resource in Argentina as well. That's considered to be, both pretty sizable as well as, promising from a cost structure standpoint. But it is true that the resident knowledge on and the expertise on fracking is all based in Houston and the Gulf Coast. And while some of that can be exported at a management level, at a tactical in the field operational level, where so many decisions are made that make the difference between being economic at $35 a barrel versus $50 a barrel, it's not going to be easy to export. So as well as, I think the other issue is, if shale production starts in other places, this is probably a bigger risk and a bigger risk factor, frankly, is will there be capital discipline in those other markets? So if shale begins to get exploited in a significant way in other countries, will capital discipline, like we've seen in the US shale basin in the past 18 to 24 months, will that type of discipline happen, or will some combination of less sophisticated business practices and or government policies to promote production at all costs, will that cause surpluses in the market? That's probably a bigger risk, frankly, than the cost and knowledge advantage that Texas holds.
Okay, another question. Do we know the extent to which the pandemic is accelerating Texas low carbon transition or diversification?
That's a great question. I don't know that we do yet. We've been looking at this, but we haven't really researched that question. Maybe you guys at UT have taken a look at that. What I think we do know is that we have started to see, not so much because of the pandemic, but because of the increased focus on climate change, including the resurgence of this at the federal level by the Biden administration, companies reacting to this. And so I would say it's more around climate change than the pandemic. But we have in the work we're doing in Houston on the energy transition, we've seen a market change even in the last year. And I think that's quite exciting and really sort of points to the direction in which we need to head in Texas. It's not saying that, and we're not saying, as you can tell from this research, that the oil and gas industry is going away tomorrow. It's simply that, we need to leverage the skills that we have into other areas. And so, I would say it's more around, focusing on the energy transition and the opportunities than it is, the impact of the pandemic on oil prices, which we saw last year. Now, having said that, I do think companies are becoming more efficient and, starting to operate at lower break.
Looks like we have another glitch. Brett, we're going to wait to see if you rejoin. Well, we may have lost the connection with Brett. Hey, Richard, are you still on?
I am.
Okay, great. So let me just ask a follow-up question to something you had mentioned about capital discipline.
Yeah.
And in the past, who was it, Bethany, who wrote the book Saudi America?
Right.
And so from what I've talked to different people, folks in the oil and gas industry would prefer a 60, like something constant
Right.
in terms of the price. But given it seems like just the natural commodity dynamics, there's a difference in the delays between a supply response and a demand response, because those are both global, right? And one could be shorter than the other, and plus political instabilities, all sorts of dynamics. But just a question, I know that these are not meant to be forecasts, they're meant to be scenarios, but would you consider the boom bust scenario to be more likely than the other ones, especially something common?
Yeah, I mean, there's a trite saying in the investment community, and one thing you know about a forecast is it's wrong. And for sure, one thing about the constant $60 a barrel and the 40 declining to $30 a barrel on a very smooth curve, that's extremely unlikely. There's more likely to be cyclical variation. So the variation might be around a flat number around 50 or 60. It might be on a declining trend, but you're likely to see some boom and bust cyclicality almost in any projection that you might make. So I would agree that the flat line, the straight line scenarios that we presented, while illustrative, don't really represent the way that the oil market tends to clear in real life.
Okay, thank you. And then how much can renewables, or are renewables making up for some of this? I mean, it must be a different scale given severance taxes. Hi, Brett, thanks for rejoining.
Yeah, sorry about that. We're having technical gremlins today. I don't know what the problem is.
Okay, we were just talking about a final question about how much can renewable, since this is an energy state, we're blessed with so many energy forms, how much can renewables help with the revenue base that may be lost in some of these scenarios for oil and gas?
No, Richard, did you have a thought on that?
Just a top of mind thought. I mean, most of the tax, the short answer is Texas does have tremendous renewables opportunity. I don't think there are many revenue streams that are tapping it currently. And, around the country in general, the renewable energy advocates in the past, 20 years have been basically asking for tax abayances and forgivenesses and subsidies. So this would be a case if Texas were to try and make up any shortfalls or declines in revenues from the E&P side of the energy spectrum by taxing renewables. That would be, if not a first, it would be an early precedent in that direction. However, that's not to say the economics of renewables are becoming so attractive that rather than being subsidized, there's really arguably there is some substantial headroom there where it could afford, to be taxed as opposed to be subsidized. This is one of the things that rarely happens in real world, where an industry goes from being subsidized to being taxed. Subsidies tend to stay around for a long time, and new taxes are very, are not common to implement. But I know in our discussions, Brett and I, with Texas 2036, this topic did come up. We didn't quantify it, and we didn't, recommend it per se, but it clearly is an opportunity that could be investigated and, arguably should be on the table.
Yeah, so one of the questions that came up from the audience was, Texas has been fortunate to rely on oil and gas, and I think the question alluded to not having an income tax. So if it comes down to where to get revenue to make up, do you see a greater appetite for an income tax versus some sort of tax on the production of renewables? Or how would you weigh that? What would be your speculation?
I will let Brett answer that one.
If you're really throwing us under the bus here, aren't you? Asking us to pick between, the third rail of Texas politics, a
an income tax, and the wrath of which I'm sure we'll be getting emails from every renewable company, in Texas right now about some of this discussion. So I think I'm gonna dodge that one.
Well, it was a very hard question purposely, and excellent presentation. We apologize to the audience and you all for the technical glitches, and thank you so much for sharing your insights and your time with us.
Yeah, and Dave, you can post the slides. You'd asked about that, so feel free to do that, and they'll be posted on the center's website as well, futurehouston.org. So you can get them from the UT. Are they going to be on the Energy Institute website, or where do they go?
I'll figure that out. Either YouTube or UT Energy Symposium or our Energy Institute website.
Okay, they'll be on our website as well. So
okay.
You can.
Thank you again so much.
Okay.
Thank you. It was an honor and pleasure. Thank you.